This work is currently being revised for the Oxford Journal of Design History. The title I believe you have today is Behind the Bezel. The new title will be Beyond the Bezel. I don't know exactly what that entails, but I thought, because I've had this paper out on the road quite a lot, I've given versions of it at University of Rochester, Malmo, Umel, Gothenburg, and this kind of ends the trip of me trying to get a response and feedback on this paper that I think, or I hope, will radically kind of explode the way we think of the history of coin ops, the way we think of the ontology of a game itself. And I'm really interested to see if there's any design historians or interaction design people in the audience. I'm always trying to solicit feedback from people who work on design, because one of my goals is to make the case that this history I'm interested in around the history of coin ops is a history of hardware, but also a history of hardwood. Okay, so I will start my timer to make sure I'm on time, and I'll try not to step out of the paper. I often, when I'm reading, I like to kind of move outside of the paper and annotate a few points. I'm particularly happy today, and I'm kind of buzzing a little bit. I met Reagan Cheng last night, who is the industrial designer for Atari. We had a wonderful 4-hour interview meal, and he allowed me to pat myself on the back with some of the analogies he was drawing that I've drawn in this paper as well. So I kind of felt underneath the table quietly going, yes, I knew that was the case. So I'm quite excited that I feel some of these claims that may seem outlandish actually have a touch of reality and truth to them. So you'll see when we get to these points. Okay, so when discussed within game studies, the cabinet of the coin-operated arcade video game machine, it's a key word for me, machine, has been deemed a container to house electronic components or designated a package expressive of its game content. Both, of course, are very understandable. The cabinet serves a utilitarian purpose. It safely presents to the public electronic components required to run a video game. In doing so, it must be durable to protect its electronics during factory distribution through operator route transport to installation within various locations. Not to mention general wear of play and vandalism. And I would also add mops. One of the greatest forms of damage to a coin-op cabinet are mops that janitors would use to clean arcades. Today, when coin ops are in museums, it's strollers that create the greatest kind of effect in terms of damaging these particular artifacts. Like the back glass of its pinball predecessor, the cabinet packaging actively advertises the game. Its marquee, often backlit, bezel, the plastic membrane shielding the machine's monitor, control panel, front panel, and sides may contain topography, color, and graphics, all designed to excite, inform, entice, define, and attract players to the game. In the above description of package, it is the noun form of the word that predominates in the field of game studies. The verb form implies other variations that I find to be quite fascinating. It denotes a process to make into a package and a means to present a product. These are kind of basic ways of thinking about packaging in the context of package design. This form of package encourages investigations into the history of coin-op cabinet design to better comprehend its industrial and graphic design, while gaining insights into how both assisted in the presentation of the then new medium of the commercial arcade video game. But I do want to state, though, that if the cabinet as package remains prevalent within game studies, then the field does not presently possess a sufficient vocabulary to parse the design history of its artifact. When game studies or within game studies, the term game design, and this is a very reductive definition, please keep that in mind, involves the creation of content in context of a video game. Rule systems, narrative, balancing, characters, levels, audio, interface, and gameplay fall under the rubric of game design. Game development accounts for game or design practices rendered on-screen, game design for software, and adherence with platform constraints and platform support. This usage of game design runs cold, I think, when asked to attend to the industrial design of consoles, package design of software products, let alone the compound design practices applied to the medium of the coin-op cabinet. So I guess if there is a polemic in this paper, this would be it. A more encompassing recognition of design is called for to complement the prevailing game design so that other actors and practices can become meaningful to game history. Video games are complex and wide-ranging, and our scholarly engagement with their design history ought to be as well. So the game design that this work begins to probe, or we might want to say I'm trying to unpack the cabinet, is one that encases the monitor, a study fixed on the surfaces of coin-op arcade video game machine cabinets. When I use phrases like game graphics, I'm referring to what appears on the outside of a screen. When broached historically, game historians typically recite this kind of common birth of narrative around the foundations of video game history, starting with the so-called futuristic design of Nutting Associates Computer Space from 1971. These same historians often trivialize the past, and this is referring to the unusual boob controllers, as they were known, on Atari's Gotcha, designed by George Faraco in 1973. Or these historians will often celebrate industry success stories. This primarily takes the form of Pong in 1972. Or the cabinet is ignored altogether when the word video game is allowed to usurp medium specificity. Such topics are in lieu of the fact that very little scholarly work exists on arcade video game cabinet design in general. The most basic of questions have not been addressed to any real effect. Did relationships exist between game designers and artists responsible for the look of the cabinet? How did individual coin-op companies or divisions organize and manage their art departments? And what was the conceptualization process for illustrating the actions and themes of a game played upon a modified television? Rarely have more complicated questions been dared, questions consonant with the role and function cabinet design and artwork serve in defining the game. Again, these are ontological questions, I feel. The phenomenology of historic play and human embodiment of material technological coin-op artifacts. After all, coin-ops are convincing exemplars of interaction design before the term was even coined. So again, it's time to unpack the cabinet, I would say. The medium that delivered video games up until the 1990s, and this is something we often forget, the coin-op was a standard for video game production in comparison to the home console well into the early 90s. I think we see that a lot with a lot of migration of coin-op titles to the home console format. My basic position in the critical historical study of video games, one in accordance with concerns expressed by curators in game preservation, as well as having some overlap with platform studies, is that more exists to games than what appears on screen. Whereas platform studies digs down to the code or to the metal in its vernacular, I prefer to scale surfaces made of wood, plastic, glass, cardboard, and fiberglass. Forms molded and adorned to help constitute the game as well as the experience of play. Forms anything but neutral, far from uniform. You might say, as I've joked earlier, I study hardware and hardwood. In researching game history, I treat material culture studies, museum studies, history of technology, science and technology studies, and most pertinent here, design history. Not as neighboring fields, but as binding ingredients for the cultivation of a game history mindful of method, theoretical analyses, archival research, and artifacts. Game histories will benefit greatly from the wide spectrum of attention that design history applies to product conception and development, process, practice, production, consumption, use, users, failure, sustainability, and disposal. It's a long list. The general ebb and flow of things as they move through time and space over their cultural life histories. Likewise, design history studies the materiality and materials of industrial and product design to better understand and explain social and cultural experiences between people and design things within everyday life. This is precisely why I offer the rather cumbersome phrase, coin-op arcade video game machine. The phrase methodizes the video game, the electronic computational or transistor logic system, display device, controller interface, and power supply as part of a greater whole. Machine accounts for the entire material apparatus rather than privilege only its electronic components. A component like the cabinet is regarded as constitutive of the meanings, experiences, and functions of the machine, much like the circuitry used to run the game. I'm interested in both microprocessors and marquees. So my remaining words today explores cabinet or arcade cabinet design in particular with attention to machines produced between 1971 and 1979, before color monitors and multicolored graphics became prevalent. The aim is neither to edify the artist nor exalt a general design aesthetic, but to learn how cabinets co-shaped their games. Restricting myself to a period before the video game craze hit full swing with its major stars and horizons, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, for instance. And with design paradigms of older electromechanical games, I'll just simply say EM machines here on out, still prevalent, provides a look into machines whose cabinets played a much larger role in filling in the gaps when the modified TVs behind the bezel still radiated in black and white. Technological constraints compelled cabinet design to play a contributory, if not constitutive role in defining the game as well as game play. I close with a brief, and I will say very brief depending on time of course, introspective discussion of the particular problems faced in the research of coin-op history while signaling the importance of design history to the critical historical study of video games. So part one, towards a design history of coin-op cabinets. Bill Kurtz's The Encyclopedia of Arcade Video Games opens with a bold claim. 1971 is hailed as the year that everything changed, according to Kurtz, with the introduction of Nutting Associates Computer Space. A strange-looking game began to appear in arcades, Kurtz recalls, in contrast to pinball and other types of EM machines like shooting and driving games. Nutting's machine must have looked an exception, without flippers, plungers, and cabinet artwork stenciled upon its surfaces, especially with its statuesque yellow or metallic flake structure pedestaling a 13-inch General Electric black and white television that replaced the more familiar enclosed mixed media playfield of EM machines. We'll see examples of this in a moment. Kurtz's book, as some of you may know, is a collector's guide. It's one of those big Schiffer books on collecting objects. He can be forgiven for such an overzealous decree of change attributed to a single catalyst, even when boasting a computer brain box, though built, and I'm going to credit Henry for this line, entirely of dedicated circuits based on TV technology. His narrative, however, is not that far from how many writers of game history account for the history of coin-op games. An invention and innovation beeline, this is kind of one typical trajectory we often see in game histories, advancing from computer space to Pong, through Key Games as Tank, Key Games being a subsidiary of Atari, kind of a faux company to be created as a rival, and Atari's breakout to conclude with indefatigable stories of 100-yen coin shortages in Japan sparked by the popularity of Tato's Space Invaders and the fever caused by Pac-Man. That trajectory still dogs game historiography when researching the history of coin-ops. Game history is yet to shake itself free from its own version of design history's Pevsnerian past. Like Nikolaus Pevsner's Pioneers of the Modern Movement, originally published in 1936, writers of game history have tended to ply their craft in a tradition of memorializing, if not canonizing, great men, inventors, innovators, designers, entrepreneurs, and often celebrate the games they built as examples of good design, or at least exemplary of technological improvements. Cultural historian Erkki Hutamo is well known, has denominated such writing as chronicle, one devoted exclusively to recapitulating landmarks, breakthroughs, and founding fathers. And I will say this, I live for the day where I no longer have to include that line in anything I write, because I think with Henry's work and Erkki's work, it's two of the most kind of critical engagements of game historiography. I fall back on his line so often because I still think it holds true. So I'm waiting for that moment where I can let go of that line because game history has gotten better. That's what I'm sort of living for, so to speak. On account of this, the task of the game historian has been restricted to that of chronicler, of game designers, game companies, and their accomplishments. Hutamo's insistence that video game historians broaden their view to the longer history of pre-digital games and account for EM antecedents to video games is a perspective that I embrace and will periodically revisit before suggesting another direction for a design history of game artifacts at the end of today's talk. What is clear from Hutamo's critique of histories of games written in the first decade of the 21st century, as well as the game historian's bullish prerogative of maintaining hierarchical pretenses when writing history, is that such persistent chronicling omits other actors from contributing to the history of games. Premising the history of coin-ops solely on their technological capabilities, although completely reasonable, smacks of technological determinism as a master trope for writing this history, while negating the influence non-computational or even non-electronic components play. Again, that I think sounds, to hear that out loud, it sounds really outlandish to accuse the history of video games of kind of buying into a narrative of technological determinism, but I hope to show you that cardboard and blow-molded plastic have a role to play as well. Hutamo as well, I'm sorry, did I skip a page? No, I don't think I did. No, let me back up here. So here's a question. This is why I put this slide up. What would computer space be without its cabinet? A naked assembly of a store-bought television set, a portable TV at that, 3 circuit boards, an external speaker, a coin box, a power supply, and a cooling fan. I'm not suggesting that we operate with such severe separations, but urge those interested in this era of game history to attend to all actors that shaped the medium when the proper noun video game was still a neologism. It's equally troubling that such linear narratives of technological progress fail to consider how the coin-op video game gained its cabinet form. It's as if it just appeared. Setting aside the heroic tale of Nolan Bushnell scurrying off in solitude to sculpt a miniature clay model of computer space's cabinet, video game cabinet design had a predecessor in EM games built in large, bulky, heavy, upright game cabinets. Henry Lowood is correct when he claims that the modular configuration utilized in the internal cabinet of computer space would remain essentially unchanged for generations. This does not preclude, though, that computer space was far removed from design assemblies of other prevailing generation of EM games. Tech journalist Benji Edwards posits a comparison overlooked when proclaiming the change wrought by computer space. Computer space, he writes in his blog, sported a display on top, controls in the middle, and a coin box at the bottom in an all-in-one stand-up unit similar to electromechanical arcade games such as Sega's Missile, which was released only 2 years prior in 1969. Is anybody familiar with this game, out of curiosity? Didn't think so. Missile utilized a stand-up cabinet as opposed to more typical horizontal cabinet of pinball. Nearly every inch of the large cabinet's formica-like coated surface is graphically illustrated to convey, we might even say package, the theme of the game. Players controlled a motorized model tank to fire light gun missiles at airplanes, whose imagery was looped on a film strip projected within the cabinet. It was not a video game by any stretch of the imagination. I'm certainly not making that claim. And it looked nothing like computer space. Its cabinet design, both internally and externally, nonetheless still offers much to the study of video game history. Gutamo maintains that the shift from EM machines to video games was not a clean rupture, but more of a continuity, whereby physical interfaces, an assortment of controller devices, as well as game types, already existed in pre-digital arcades. For instance, precursors to Midway's 1977 video game machine Seawolf can be found in its EM version, Sea Raider from '69, and Sea Devil from 1970. Such a claim is not limited to game type, but resounds for cabinet design as well. Sega's Missile, Midway's SAMI, which stood for Surface-to-Air Missile Interceptor from 1970, share similar cabinet artwork, not to mention game concept, with Atari's renowned arcade video game Missile Command from 1980. This observation, I think, is important to understand the coin-op industry during this era, and in particular Atari's design ethos. Atari, founded in June 1972, as many know, by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, fresh from their work on computer space with Nutting Associates, did not have a history of EM machines like many of its soon-to-be Chicago-based rivals. This meant that the newly founded company did not possess a stable of existing EM game cabinets to serve as design templates for the integration of display monitors and television circuitry to run a game. Instead, Atari designed the cabinet for its launch title Pong from the ground up. Pong's cabinet is of a modern, minimalist style compared to what was declared gaudy, if not old-fashioned, upon its arrival. EM machines more at home at rambunctious boardwalks and game rooms than hotel lobbies, restaurants, and cocktail bars. The machine's cabinet design boasted a lone but bold color in juxtaposition to its dark wood grain veneer that also added an earth tone to this new technological artifact entering our everyday spaces. Pong expanded the social and commercial spaces available for coin-op amusements. And do keep in mind, in this time period, pinball was still illegal in many US cities. In doing so, Atari aimed to distinguish its machine from pinball, and this is expressed both in terms of the type of game that it displayed conjointly with the cabinet design. Many so-called ball and paddle games adopted a similar aesthetic. Veneer wood grain siding replaced the stenciled artwork found on pinball and EM machines. Like Missile, while illustrated bezels were used on fleets of Pong clones manufactured by a number of Chicago-based companies. In other words, this is a design on aesthetic that stuck for the early days of all of these Pong clones that came out in 1972 and into 1973. So Atari didn't just make a new type of game, it also introduced a new design paradigm for coin-ops. That's one of the key points I'm attempting to make today. A video game cabinet with wood grain sides gained entrances into locations not typically reserved for large, boisterous EM cabinets. Location is a constraint in the planning of cabinet design and often determined the overall look of the machine. Although not a ball and paddle game, Formula K's promotional flyer makes this point very well. You're not able to see it from this fine print, so I'll just read this to you. In addition to the machine's 23-inch Motorola monitor and mimetic steering wheel controller, the cabinet is extolled tasteful, wood grain cabinet, can be placed in all plush locations. Side artwork on Atari's products, mainly stencils of game titles in the early 1970s, did appear 1 year later after the release of Pong with Gotcha and Super Pong, both Super Pongs from '74. Yet Atari first refrained from fully embracing the design typical of older EM machines for its new arcade video games. Lack of cabinet artwork on Pong directed all attention to the television monitor, glowing with the promise of something new. Playable images displayed on the monitor were the art of the cabinet, we might say. The monitor was installed upright at a 90-degree angle. Basically, there was a piece of wood on the inside of the machine, and the portable TV was just placed upright on top of that, as if viewable from a tabletop, and not oriented at a 45-degree angle, which later became typical in upright cabinet design. The bezel for Pong exaggerated the size of the machine's 13-inch television screen. A matte black recess behind a larger yellow wooden shroud sucked in the viewer's perspective, giving the impression that playfield was much more profound than it actually was. Phosphorus shapes like a bouncing ball, Atari may have felt, did not warrant additional packaging. In fact, it may have distracted from this game altogether. This period, of course, was short-lived. By the mid-1970s, as I'm sure many of us know, most likely due to increased competition from other manufacturers, together with the expansion of Atari's art department, Atari released Stunt Cycle with a topographic marquee and accompanying illustrated side art. Illustrated bezels also became standard with key games as Tank and Tank 2 from 1974. By 1979, wood siding was completely gone altogether. Atari's bezels, marquees, and cabinets dripped top to bottom with highly detailed sci-fi fantasy illustrations for the likes of Lunar Lander and Asteroids. And I think one connection we can make to this era in particular was the popularity of space as a theme in science and in terms of science fiction film, but also how many space games were on the market in this time period. Although computer technology began to redefine the coin-op industry, design paradigms of EM machines persevered, continually imprinting their influence upon video game cabinets even once socket holders protected microchips on a printed circuit board. The 1970s, I would argue, is a period of hybridization in coin-op design when the style of EM cabinets supported the technology of arcade video game machines. Accounting for coin-op machine design within the broader history of electronic games, and not just the introduction of television technology into amusement machines, we quickly realized that the past is a lot less tidy than game history's presiding beeline would lead us to believe. Accepting this mess, if you will, I think it's fair to say that computer space was not the only game in town in 1971. Whereas Nutting's machine displayed intergalactic battle across its televisual playfield, Chicago Coin's twin rifle gave its players a realistic, full-dimensional hunting ground, not displayed on a black and white television, but created by blow-molded plastic, black lights, fluorescent paint, and mirror trickery. A manufacturer of mechanical and EM coin-op amusement machines since the 1930s, Chicago Coin's machine is the antithesis of computer space. Yet, a number of design elements, fairly common in the era of EM games, became features translated into coin-op arcade video game machines across the 1970s and well into the 1980s. In fact, last night I discovered that a game made by Namco I've never heard of before, a Ghost-based game, was still using mirrors on the inside of the cabinet well into the era of color graphics. I think this was 1991. Reagan Cheng mentioned this to me, so I need to find out when mirrors no longer appeared in cabinets. I thought it was up until the early 80s, but he's saying it actually extended into the 1990s. I have a couple of examples of these I'll show you. Players used mounted wooden guns to test their skill against mechanical fluorescent pop-up targets interspersed across the playfield, set within a 72-inch high, 40-inch deep, and 31-inch wide cabinet. Computer Space's fiberglass cabinet may have given the impression, as Benji Edwards exclaims, that it is a molten dollop of technology, whereas Twin Rifle reached backwards to the older technology and techniques of the Magic Lantern and diorama. Players dug their shoulders into the butt of a rifle to line up targets through a bezel resembling pinball backglass. Its bezel artwork, while informative and instructive, also served to thematically frame the playfield. Forest imagery applied to the bezel foregrounded the game's setting, adding depth to the internal playfield housed behind the plastic membrane. Players shot through a narrow tree-lined transparent rectangular section of the bezel at targets within a painted panoramic landscape playfield illuminated by black lights and given the illusion of depth by mirrors. We play a reflection. The playfield is located at the front bottom of the machine. So if I'm standing at the machine, the actual playfield is located here. What I'm shooting at is a mirror reflected this way. Like a diorama, the cabinet's lower interior sides are illustrated to depict a land and cloudscape. Multi-scaled model trees texture the fluorescent blow-molded plastic to provide a detailed geological terrain of rugged landforms, a lake, and foothills within which targets spring up. Inside coin-op arcade cabinets, plastic moldings provided scenery for EM playfields like Twin Rifle. This mode of augmenting a playfield within the internal space of the cabinet continued with integration of monitors into coin-op arcade games. Such an arrangement between video game and EM machine, industrial and graphic design is evident in Midway's Boot Hill from 1977. The machine utilized an Intel 88 CPU with a black and white monitor for its Western gunfighter game. When standing at a Boot Hill machine, its 23-inch monitor is housed upward at a 20-degree angle, directed away from the player and into the cabinet. Unlike Pong, the monitor does not occupy a player's direct line of sight. Monitor output is reflected onto the cabinet's plastic playfield by a 45-degree angle half-silvered mirror. Half of the monitor's light passes through the mirror, while the other half is reflected to converge monitor output with plastic playfield. The output image appears superimposed on the perpendicular playfield illuminated by blacklight with its graphics glowing due to fluorescent paint. The effect? Two phosphorescent gunslingers shoot it out in an Old West style setting. Players control the on-screen movement, but essentially play a game in reverse. A reflection projected onto scenery providing graphic details to an otherwise monochrome game with raster graphic pixel pattern figures. Without the cabinet's plastic background, the player would only navigate their character around the quadrant of a 23-inch monitor controlling white phosphorus images on black. Perspective was achieved by a vanishing point, the illustration of a cemetery perched upon Boot Hill with the sun setting in a distant horizon and neighboring structures positioned in the foreground for scale, as we see here. This was taken at California Extreme last summer. Boot Hill's cabinet assisted the technological constraints of its game to boast a full color playfield. In this context, the cabinet is far more than packaging and container. It's a crucial part in defining the actual game. I would even go as far as to say the container becomes content in this case. This claim is realized further with Vector Beam's 1979 machine, Warrior. Tim Skelly built the game using the Vector Beam development hardware engineered by Larry Rosenthal and first applied to Cinematronics' best-selling Space Wars from 1977. The use of vector graphics, geometrical points and line segments, as opposed to the more predominant raster graphic display system for coin-ops, was, as Tim Skelly mused, fantastic for rotating objects on screen. The objects in question are two sword-wielding figures inspired by the fantasy fiction of Michael Moorcock's character Elric, the albino warrior whose famed sword Stormbringer, if anybody played Dungeons & Dragons back in the 70s, this is a pretty obvious reference, swallows the souls of those its blade strikes. Warrior presents its figures via an aerial perspective. We see heads, upper torsos, kind of arms swinging, as we duel within the confines of a monitor. The machine's 19-inch monitor is positioned flat at the center of the cabinet and slightly inclined out towards the player. As with Boot Hill, the monitor itself only displays the score and player character figures. The playfield background consists of artwork depicting 4 stone staircases, ramps, and 2 pits housed within a castle. This scenery is reminiscent of blacklight posters, fantasy artwork of the era. ultraviolet light lending an eerie yet fantastic glow to the game's brilliant vector display, adding layers of vibrant color to a game lacking true RGB color graphics. I'll show you two slides here. This was taken at the Strong National Museum of Play. We've taken the cabinet apart. This is me with my camera looking directly into the machine. This is the mirror. So you see this is the artwork inside the cabinet. If you look up top, those kind of openings, when you see this in the context of the game, those are actually the pits. Inside of the cabinet, you have cardboard cones that extend up to the top of the actual cabinet itself. So it's actually built with depth into it. When put into the cabinet and projected through a mirror, it looks as if we've got pits located directly underneath the characters, as we see here. So this is the game we would actually see in the context of play. So we're actually looking at what appears here above in the actual cabinet, when in the context of gameplay is then projected by way of mirror onto the bottom of the screen. Hence, it's overlaid directly on top of the monitor. The depiction of pits provided pictorial context for the action of player characters. The action of a player character falling into a bottomless pit was achieved, according to Skelly, by scaling down the size of the character. This was far from seamless, as the vector image would remain at its usual level, even when appearing within the artwork of the pit. The machine's playfield in this instance is less decorative than contextual. Warrior attempted to strategically sync its monitor output with its playfield artwork to give the illusion of player characters ascending stone staircases or descending to their deaths. For Warrior, and this was very unusual in this time period for coin-op design, Skelly enlisted the services of comic book and fantasy artist Frank Brunner, known then for his Bronze Age work on Marvel's Doctor Strange and Howard the Duck, along with horror illustration for Warren Publications' Vampirella. Brunner was also esteemed for his illustration of warriors like Marvel's Conan and Red Sonja, as well as his artwork for Heavy Metal magazine, depicting, not without coincidence, Michael Moorcock's cult character, Elric. Brunner is responsible for the playfield artwork as well as the cabinet's exterior artwork. An artist of fantasy was commissioned to ply his trade on a coin-op arcade video game machine program for swordplay. Without his contribution to the playfield, Skelly has stated that his game would just look like two piles of angry glowing sticks. I can extend that sentiment to the cabinet's exterior as well. Without Brunner's commercial artwork, it would look like a large nondescript wooden container. Warrior's side art consisted of large stickers instead of silkscreen images attached to its all-white sides. I recently did an interview with Frank Brunner. He told me that the stickers actually held his fine line artwork much better than stencils would have. What subject matter for cabinet illustration can be translated from two pairs of glowing sticks? George Opperman, who directed Atari's coin-op graphic design department, as well as produced original artwork for its machines and promotional materials, explains that an illustrator must be able to translate that blip into something, a character, a monster, a design, an abstract symbol. The translation of Warrior's sword-fighting theme must have come easy for an illustrator who previously lent his hand to the Savage Sword of Conan in 1978. Swords and sword fighting fiercely punctuated the action of gameplay across the contours of the cabinet. Side art illustrated the game's content in bold comic book style with 3D effect of the game's title, Warrior, heading a fantasy scene of two warriors with swords locked in what we might describe as cosmic combat. The stone interior of the playfield leading to a castle set ominously in the distance, and battle-worn skulls finalized the image. Brunner's signature appears towards the bottom of the scene. He actually signed his artwork. We see this a lot in pinball backglass artwork, but rarely, if ever, do we see this in an arcade cabinet, which was a practice very uncommon. We could say, though, that Brunner's signature appears on every surface. The amount of illustration on the vector beam cabinet is absolutely staggering. Players peer through the plastic membrane of a bezel adorned by flames. Even the playfield artwork is surrounded by interior cabinet artwork to further immerse gameplay within the world furnished by a cabinet. Skelly gives full credit to cabinet artwork for promoting the game to potential players, and this supports the notion of cabinet artwork as advertising, as a package, we might say. To conclude here, though, misses his most important insight on Warrior. Writing on Brunner's artwork for the machine, Skelly insists that it helped to flesh out the bare bones of early primitive video game graphics. Like the output of its mirrored monitor display merged with hand-painted play-filled graphics, cabinet and video games coalesce to form the game of the coin-op arcade machine. I will end this part of my talk by saying that Boot Hill and Warrior are not cherry-picked examples, but indicative of a general design practice of coin-op video games throughout the 1970s, a practice that regarded the machine's cabinet not as a neutral container, but as an active instrument for gameplay. Sorry about the quality of this image. One of the most iconic arcade video games of all time also utilized the mirror projection technique, coupled with play-filled artwork, Midway's Space Invaders in 1978. Perhaps it is difficult to accept this when cultural memory, as well as MoMA, have ostensibly colorized the game's graphics. Space Invaders did not utilize a color monitor for its game graphics. The machine's 19-inch black and white monitor was recessed within a very large EM-like cabinet, and like Boot Hill, utilized a mirror to reflect the phosphorus output displayed upon an illustrated lunar background. The inclusion of color graphics resulted from color cellophane applied directly to the monitor. I've got some direct examples of this. This is the back panel removed. This piece is the actual play field of the game. That's just held in by a number of staples within the cabinet itself. Once removed, this is the artwork. So this is the play field that the monitor projects onto. This is the monitor itself with strips of colored cellophane directly applied to the monitor to give the impression of color graphics when playing. Furthermore, the machine's bezel aligned with the background artwork akin to Twin Rifle's bezel to provide a 3D effect to the play space, while detailed color illustrations of space monsters, a laser cannon, and lunar craters penetrated the transparent frame to help intensify intergalactic action. Nearly 10 years after Pong, Atari's Warlord as well utilized multicolored overlays so that its black and white monitor mirror reflected its output upon its battlefield scenery. You can see this is just painted cardboard on the inside of the machine. An abrupt end to EM machine design practices and paradigms did not occur. Even one of Atari's promotional flyers for Pong, the product that revolutionized the amusement game industry, depicted the machine achieving liftoff, apparently, or appearing to, leave the old industry behind. Part 2, design history into game history. Apart from the descriptive fact-based linear accounts comprising the history of electronic coin-op machines mentioned previously, other barriers obstruct the ability to research this history, and in particular raise problems for the design history of game artifacts. Materials that document the history of arcade cabinet design are only now starting to find their way into cultural institutions. I've worked on 2 collections, one housed here at Stanford and the other at the Strong. Research often is delimited by these collections. Hence, the company Atari plays a very large evidentiary role in the history of coin-ops until materials from other companies for the coin-op divisions enter into the care of cultural custodians, if that's even possible, in terms of the history of a lot of Chicago-based coin-op companies that have vanished and disappeared. A workaround to archival bias is to consult resources provided by antiquarians, enthusiasts, and private collectors of coin-ops. While we can observe a computer space just a few miles down the road at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, we are less likely to behold a Boot Hill or EM machines. That's why I asked the question earlier if any of you ever actually played Missile. These games are very hard to find these days. We need collectors, private collectors, who can provide access to these collections so we can actually work on these artifacts. To work with original design artifacts and not just stare at promotional arcade flyers online, researchers must travel to annual events like California Extreme, visit independent micro-museums like the American Classic Arcade Museum in New Hampshire, or rely upon the generosity of private collectors. Researchers at museums typically only work with a tiny representative sample of existing coin-op artifacts. Private collectors are prone to reach well beyond the usual suspects to obtain the obscure. Less popular titles with shorter production runs compared to, say, a Miss Pac-Man not only become trophy items in a private collection, but in the context of research can, as they have here, offer alternative models to gauge game history while providing advantage of difference amongst, or against, I should say, against the prevailing continuum. In Game After, I followed Hutamo to claim that we are now experiencing an era of collection to help counter the generalist, descriptive survey of game history that we were not able to benefit from previously. As Victor Morgulin argued over 20 years ago in his appraisal of the state of design history, the expanse of design history subject matter since the mid-1930s when Pevsner published his Pioneers seems to be just another matter of redrawing the design map. And I think that's really important for game history because is it the case that having more access to more materials necessarily means we're going to have better history? I don't think the two actually equate to one another. I hope they can, depending on the types of work that's being done on these artifacts. So what is needed here in thinking about Margolin's claim, as Margolin asserted as well, is to think about a radical rethinking of the discipline. Okay, how can we rethink the discipline of the study of game history or the field of game studies based upon these collections that we now have access to? I have flagged the field of design history as formative of my research and not just design, primarily expressed in game studies as software development. The reason for doing so is that a correlation exists between long-standing disciplinary debates within design history, design studies, that have proven influential in shaping the contemporary scholarship and the current state of the historical study of games, within which scholars of game history are now beginning to move away from this era of chronicle that Hutamo described in 2003. Researchers of game history may be on the verge of having to confront the dilemma of the history of games being one possible area of research within the broader field of game studies that has been very slow to turn its attention to critical historiography, or game history, capital G, capital H, as a specialization within historical scholarship, a mixed disciplinary era of study drawing its methodologies from the various fields mentioned at the beginning of this talk. A more broadly constituted game history is certainly desirable, especially one attentive to the field of design history. It is my intention that the emergence of a critical historical study of games be counted among those new topics, theories, and methods invited to the so-called design historical table that Chettle Fallon has set as essential, this is the direct quote, essential to keep the discipline dynamic and vital. So far, the study of video games, even with an emphasis on the history of technology, has not made much of a dent in either design history or design studies, judging from the lack of work included in journals and books in the field. For this reason, I tend to only publish my work in game history and design journals, trying to make an inroad into that field. Ideally, the design historical table would be a multi-course setting, with design history also nourishing the critical historical study of games, as I have tried to demonstrate via services rarely scaled in both game studies and design history. One thing I find just challenging is that there are a lot of these books that come out in the field of design studies and design history, like 100 iconic objects, 100 best things ever designed, and rarely, if ever, do you see a game controller or a game console actually included in this collection of iconicity. So it's surprising that although design is very interested in looking at artifacts and these histories around artifacts, it seems to kind of overlook the very material existence of games. However, if we go back to Margolin, adding neglected objects or even forgotten histories to the field of game studies may still be yet another instance of redrawing the map. A radical rethinking would place a hard emphasis on history in game history, as well as pluralize the singular so that histories of illustration, package design, graphic design, commercial art, and industrial design become central to our thinking of how game design can matter. Hutamo's insistence that game historians position arcade video games within the history of electronic amusements has helped magnifying design practices extending from late 1960s EM machines to arcade games throughout the 1970s, while also highlighting how Atari's design practices attempted to outstrip, we might say, the older coin-op amusements for its new medium. But rather than remain focused on the histories of amusement devices like Hutamo, it's increasingly apparent that to compose a design history of game artifacts, we must look beyond games altogether to the history of design. This is kind of the last page I have to read for today, kind of my conclusion. Allow me to fold back on Kurtz's opening lines on computer space. Everything changed in 1971 when a strange-looking game began to appear in arcades. Would computer space, or even Pong for that matter, appear as strange in Matti Soronin's Futuro house, one lit by Vernon Panton floor Panthella lamps, or a bright Nesso table lamp designed by Giancarlo Mattiolo, or seating like Gaetano Pesci's Syria Up chair, or Olivia Margot's Jean chair, with ambient music playing through consumer electronics like a Weltron 2001 Spaceball 8-track player, and a Motorola Special black and white TV humming in the background. Game historians looking inwardly at the design of these artifacts cannot see other Cold War era products embodying a post-atomic age, late 60s to mid-70s design zeitgeist of experimentation and playful forms, colors, materials, and optimistic futures, come psychedelia, come late modern or early postmodern aesthetics, applied in the vibrant plastics of Aero Arnios Pastille chair and Panasonic Tudor-loop transistor radios. Without design history, game studies' treatment of its own design history is doomed to vacuous analogies. Computer space as futuristic, a 1957 DeSoto, or a prop from the sci-fi film Barbarella. A game history informed by design history would not settle for analogy, but would provide reasons for why such analogies are drawn. Thank you.